Well, this is another day, well, another week, another Monday. This is that old surgical troubleshooting thing. I had to look at my camera to make sure it was recording, so I had a little hiccup there to begin with. Back in '77, I was working at this shop. This is actually a shot of the building, and of course, this is what it looked like, and there was a shotgun shop. You see all the way through it, and it was a place I worked. I worked there for almost a year before I went down to Texas. Had a lot of good adventures there and all that. It was back in '77, but this guy came in with a high mileage '72 Ford pickup that was making a lot of racket. It sounded like it was going to beat its brains out right there. And then I said, man, this thing's got to have, I mean, it was just awful, awful noises like I had never heard coming from under the hood of a pickup before at the time. And the boss man, who was real experienced and elderly, and he says, here, turn it off. And he turned it off. And you could see that there were chunks missing from the belt. And he took his pocket knife and he cut the belt off of it, and we started it back up, and it didn't make any noise at all. So all it needed was a belt. It astonished me, and I don't know if I've ever seen that since, with those chunks gone out of the belt, that it was making all that racket. But it genuinely sounded like it was just coming all to pieces in there. Another belt noise that I've talked about before, Dayco doesn't make these belts here anymore, but for a while they were a thing. And this thing, this guy came in on his, he's a student that had graduated from my program, and he was basically working on tractors and stuff at his dad's tractor dealership. And he had his Chevrolet pickup. It was making this whining noise. And so he had replaced a bunch of pulleys and stuff under there and all that, and he didn't have any idea what was wrong. And we took the fan, it was making a loud noise, and we took the fan off so it wouldn't, just screwed the fan off of it. And we cranked it up without that fan swinging around. They're going to cut your hands off. And I listened with using the stethoscope pipe. I realized that noise was coming from right where this belt was hitting one of the pulleys. And it's a strange looking belt. And I had seen this problem also on a Jeep and a couple other vehicles later on, and told another guy how to fix one that had a belt like this, because you would swear it was a bad bearing or a bad power steering pump or something. But when we changed out and put a regular old Gates fluffy belt on there instead of this shiny thing, it didn't make that noise anymore. The Grand Am, this is kind of a funny story. One of my students, she called to say she'd be late because her transmission was talking off in high gear. I said, check the fuses. And when she told her dad that I said that, because he was there with her when I talked to her on the phone, that guy said, he's an idiot. Fuse ain't got nothing to do with the transmission. Well, if you look at this transmission, that fuse powers up all the solenoids, and they get their ground from the PCM. If this fuse is blown, it takes off in high gear. And Jeeps are like that too. The older Jeeps were. And so she found a blown fuse, replaced it, and that fixed it. Same car, she said, my starter's bad. So I sent some of the guys to get in the car. I said, we can put a starter on it. Turned out the starter wasn't bad. I noticed that the AC compressor pulley bearing, and the bearing in this pulley was locked up. Not the compressor, just the bearing. So we replaced that with a used bearing for an old compressor. And we got her going for nearly nothing that time too. So now these homemade jumper cables of mine, I was helping this friend of mine was out there, him and this 18-year-old kid he was trying to train. This guy was a farmer, and he had his diesel tractor. He was trying to jump it off. And he had his pickup truck with some jumper cables connected, the engine running, trying to charge up the battery on the tractor so he could start that diesel motor. And I built these to jump off those big diesel Caterpillar and International Huff pipe loaders down there with them great big gigantic things with tires so big you can't even reach the top of it with your hand. Anyway, this is some 880 volt cable that they had a bunch of it left over, and I built these jumper cables from using these big old clamps and all, because I figured this is going to be some really high quality wire. Welding lead does really well too if you get some of that. So anyway, says what we're going to do is go ahead and get my cables and hook it up. So we got my cables, these cables here, you see here, and hooked it up, and it fired the tractor right up. That 18-year-old kid was surprised because he said, a different pair of cables ain't gonna make no difference. Well, he didn't realize just how much difference cables make. There was another time, there was this Buick that was getting jumped off by, they were trying to jump it off on a hot summer day out there by Winn-Dixie, and there was a couple of Winn-Dixie people out there, and they had some jumper cables that looked like pretty decent jumper cables hooked up. and they were letting the car idle and run and all that. And when I came out with my bananas, I was wearing my mechanic's uniform, and I said, "Hey, can I get my jumper cables and try them?" He goes, "Well, I guess." And so I heaved him up on my shoulder and carried him over and hooked him up from the vehicle they were jumping it from to that Buick. And as soon as we hooked it up, I said, "Give it a try," and it spun and started. And these cables here will get it done, I'm telling you, if the starter. But those little things that look like a brick, you know, about this big, they work pretty good for jumping one off. You'd be really surprised if you get one of those and keep it charged up and put it, you know, keep it with you and keep it charged up. Well, my truck battery died. I don't drive my truck as much as I used to because I got a different vehicle now, and I drive my truck usually just on the weekends. So, on the or if I got something I need to haul or whatever, I go out there after the thing's been sitting there a week, the battery's dead. I mean, just dead as a hammer. And so I said, well, fiddlesticks. This is different from the time the rats ate the wires under the hood. This is not the same story. And so I said, well, I'm gonna, you know, hooked up my equipment to see, and I had about 200 milliamps going out of the battery. I said, well, that'll kill it in a week. More than 50 milliamps, that's 0.050, is too much. And it had 4 times that much. So I said, I kept pulling, and finally I pulled that fuse right there out of there, and it did not have a draw anymore. And I said, well, look at here. Well, that feeds the instrument cluster, and on these, the instrument cluster is known to kill the battery sometimes. And so I disconnected the instrument cluster and left it unhooked for a solid week because I never, like I say, I don't drive the truck but about once a week. And with the instrument cluster disconnected, it still killed the battery. And I said, well, that's got to be in that junction box because this is a Ford XL, the 2007 model. It doesn't have a whole lot of other electronic stuff on it. It doesn't even have power windows, and it came and didn't have cruise control either, but I put it on there. Anyway, long and short of it is, I got a new junction box. The one that I pulled off of there said made in China on the back of it. The one I got from the Ford place to replace that junction box did not say made in China. And it's pretty cool though, because when you buy one of those junction boxes, it comes with all the fuses, all the relays, and all that stuff. I've still got the old junction box out there in case I ever need any of that stuff. You know, it's too good to throw away. And so anyway, this fixed it for 6 weeks. For 6 full weeks, it didn't kill the battery. Well, it started killing the battery again, and so this time when I went back in there and disconnected the instrument cluster and left it sitting there for a week, it turned out the instrument cluster was the culprit the second time around. It was made in China too, I guess. But anyway, the Ford place, I had to give them the miles on the truck and all that, and they had to order it special, and they had to program the miles into it so that it would be consistent with the number of miles that was on the truck and that were stored in the PCM and all that. And so I got that took care of. Never had any more trouble out of that. Well, this Explorer, somebody's not mine, it was one that was 2004 model, and it died. And they came in, let's see, and brought it over here. We turned on the key, we had fuel pressure, and the pump would run for 2 seconds. Whee! I don't know where all these twos came from over here, sorry about that. It was spin over, but there was no fire in the hole. It wouldn't fire up, it just spin and spin and spin. We didn't have spark, we didn't have fuel injection, even though the injectors and the coils were powered up. That basically sends you to look for a crank sensor issue. There was no security light flashing. We broke out the scan tool, no code stored, believe it or not. The data stream showed a big fat 0 on the engine RPM line. And I said, well, that's also pointing us to the crank sensor. So under the hood, we found out the belt wasn't even running on the pulley, it was running on this rubber because this pulley had slipped back off of that rubber and it went to work on the crank sensor and just sort of chewed it all up. Okay, this is what it looked like from underneath with a little bit with better light on it and all that. See how that this pulley used to be out here, but when it walked back, you can see these little marks right here. That belt was actually running on this for a pretty good while because that tensioner kept it tight, and it worked its way back into that crank sensor. When it finally destroyed the crank sensor, the motor quit, right? Okay, the replacement part fit, but it looked a little different. See, this was the one that had slipped. See how it slipped back, and this one right here was the original. That's where the, see how where that pulley was supposed to be way out here? All right, so this is the one we got from the parts store. And you notice that the crank sensor wheel looks a little different, but it's still indexed right and it worked. Didn't look quite the same, it'd be all right. This is what the crank sensor looked like, and that's what killed the engine and made it a no start. Because the cause, it says condition was no start. The cause was the balancer. The correction was replace the balancer and the crank sensor because the balancer destroyed the crank sensor. Sometimes timing belts will jump and destroy the crank sensor, and you wind up having to replace the crank sensor because of that. This was the first one I saw, that one that I just told you about. The second one I saw was the very next day on a different one of these, except it didn't quit. It basically, they heard a little belt squealing, wondered what was going on, looked under there, and the exact same thing had happened, but this one had not slipped far enough back to destroy the crank sensor, and it was still running. So we put a balancer on that too. Incidentally, these balancers are very annoying to pull, just because of the way they're designed, and that they take 6mm bolts. You got to have some really strong 6mm bolts, like 10.9 or whatever for the hardness, and then you actually have to have the long push rod on your balancer puller to go in there and push it at the bottom of that hole, instead of, you know, because if you just put your little that little cone-shaped nose on your balancer puller, you won't pull anything. You know, because you're not pushing on the crankshaft, you're only, the balancer, it's just strange, but you're gonna have to have something long to go in there, that long push rod that goes on a balancer pusher, or make something for that. So you're pushing on the bottom of that bolt hole, bring that balancer off, put it back on there. You can bump it on there with a rubber hammer far enough to where you can pull it on there with a bolt. Make sure you put some grease on the threads. The Saturn came in behind a pickup truck. This one is a serious bomb. It was worth $100 sitting beside the road. If we wanted to upsell that one, we could work on it for weeks, but that guy wouldn't buy anything he didn't have to, and I don't blame him really on a junky old car like this. It had spark and fuel injection, but whenever my student was checking fuel pressure, he says, this fuel doesn't feel right in my hand. And so we did the alcohol test using this little graduated container, and we found out it wasn't supposed to have but this much alcohol, and it had that much in it. I'm sorry, water got in there. You pour the water in there, it mixes with the alcohol, and you gain water. That's what I was basically trying to say. I'll show you how you do this. All right, if you got a rain gauge or something you buy for $2 from Lowe's, you can actually, you take a marker and mark 10 even marks on it, really even marks. All right, then you fill it up with the gas that you're testing to the 9 mark, right? Then you add enough water so it goes up to the 10 mark, and then you put your thumb over this and you shake it up. All right, 10% is the maximum for non-flex fuel vehicles. If you gain one division, you have 10% more than that. So for every additional division you gather, the alcohol wants to mix with the water more than it does the fuel, and it'll look like you've gained water. Is what it amounts to. So that'll basically, the alcohol will separate from the gas and join with the water, and it'll increase the amount of water you got. And so that's what we were basically doing in that previous slide. Now this Chrysler Crossfire quit while driving. That was pretty interesting. It led us to a PO335 led us to a crank sensor that was opening up hot. We could actually put that crank sensor in the vise, hook the meter to it. It had 1,050 ohms, which was whenever she would let it cool off, it would fire up and go again. See, so this sensor was getting hot and opening up. So we had 1,050 ohms, took the heat gun and heated it up, and whenever we got it good and hot with the heat gun, it would open up. So bang, we got that sensor. Ordered a sensor. They sent an intermotor sensor, and it didn't have 1,050 ohms. It had 1,350 ohms, and when you put that thing on there, that car might start and it might not. And that was very annoying. And so I went ahead and ordered a Bosch crank sensor that had the same part number as the original one. Got it from Amazon. It seems to me like it was $35 or something. Didn't cost near as much as the intermotor one I bought from the parts store. And whenever I put that one, measured it, 1,050 ohms, right on the button, put that one in there. She never had any more trouble with it quitting and not starting. And then we had done some other stuff on that Chrysler. One of the things that we replaced also was the alternator was bad on it, and this hood support lift right here, you can't see that picture, not a very good one. That hood support lift, believe it or not, this is ridiculous. That thing right there for that car from Chrysler was $180. The alternator was $169 from the parts store. So the alternator cost less than his hood support. You had to prop the thing up with something because this was bad, and they wanted that fixed. It only has one on that Crossfire, and it was an '05 Crossfire, by the way. And so that was, all right, till next week, you guys, appreciate you watching. This has been about 15 minutes. You know, I'm trying to make these videos move pretty fast because, you know, so people don't drop out before the end of it. And I hope you got something you can use out of this. I'll see you next week.